Hi, good morning. This is Sean Kelly with DGI Training. This is a regulation changes update for 2017. We're going to briefly discuss some changes that have been implemented in the three regulations you see on your screen, starting with 49 CFR, the IMDG code, and then, of course, IATA. I refer to 49 CFR as our American law, and that is it governs all modes of transport, and it's our American law, whether we ship by highway, by air, by rail, or by ocean. All of the requirements for transporting dangerous goods to, from, or through the United States are in 49 CFR. Then we'll also talk about some changes in the IMDG code, which is the international standard for transport by water or ocean. And then we have the IATA regulations, which is the policy and procedures manual for the International Air Transport Association, widely used regulation for the international transport of dangerous goods by air. This webinar is for informational purposes only. As you guys may know, 49 CFR is published every year. The IATA regulations are published every 2 years, and the IMDG code is published, what I just say, 49 CFR every year, IATA every year, and the IMDG code every 2 years. And our government expects you guys to stay up on the changes. And so we're presenting to you with the changes. But this is not recurrent training, and you will not receive a certificate for attending this lesson. But you can create your own memorandum on your company letterhead explaining that you attended this informational webinar which highlighted the changes. And if some of these changes affect your products and or the proper shipping names or UN numbers that you ship, fantastic. That's good for you. This is me in the North Carolina mountains a couple months ago. I've been with DGI 19 years, and before that I was in the airline industry for about 10 years, mostly in Germany, working out of the Frankfurt airport. And before that I was a helicopter pilot in the Army for almost 11 years. So my background's definitely in aviation, but having been with DGI for 18, 19 years, I've become pretty accustomed to all of the requirements for transport by ocean and by highway and by rail as well. I don't know everything. I will never, ever, ever say that I know everything. And if I can't help you find something, we have quite a cadre of staff that will be able to help us find the answer for you. We're going to start with 49 CFR. If you don't know, you see here on your screen, there is a notice of proposed rule, and then a final rule, and then 49 CFR. The procedure, the process that it takes for a new rule to enter into 49 CFR is that our government, whatever entity that might be, in our case it's going to be the Department of Transportation, and within the Department of Transportation there's an office called the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. So when they come up with a proposed rule, they enter it into what's called the Federal Register. And so that's a public notice. And it's giving us, the public, industry, time to reply or respond or comment on their notice of proposed rule. And they usually give us a time frame. It's usually 90 days, sometimes a year. At which point we have to respond. We have to comment on the notice of proposed rule. And at the end of the comment period, the government will take into account all of the comments that they receive, and they'll either adjust their proposed rule or they'll leave it the way it is and they'll make it a final rule. And then it stays a final rule until the next printing or publication of 49 CFR, at which point it's entered into the actual regulation. But even as a final rule, it carries the full weight of the government, of the regulation. A final rule is enforceable. So what I did was I went back through the Federal Register 2015, 2016, and I've highlighted those proposed rules and final rules which came into effect 2016. With the lithium batteries being number one on the list and drawing the most attention, there were several others having to do with special permits, but we'll talk about them. And here is one, a final rule HM 262, and it prohibits passengers and crew members from carrying battery-powered portable electronic smoking devices, e-cigars, e-pipes, e-cigarettes, even hookahs, in checked baggage. Why? Because these things explode. And it's not just these e-cigarettes and e-smoking devices. Cell phones or laptops are not allowed in checked baggage. They want it upstairs in the cabin. They cannot duplicate these lithium batteries that continue to explode. And as you also know, the lithium batteries in 2016 by themselves, UN 3480 is now prohibited as cargo on passenger airplanes. And last year, they prohibited UN 3090 lithium metal batteries as cargo on passenger airplanes. So both lithium batteries 3480 and UN 3090 are prohibited as cargo on passenger airplanes. And they don't want these things, these smoking devices, unattended in the cargo compartment in your checked baggage. You know that when you go for a flight, and of course now they're charging us for checked bags, so everybody's doing everything they can to cram them into their carry-on. And then when we get to the airplane, they say, oh, there's no more room in the overhead bins. So then they start taking our carry-on bags and they say, make sure that you remove all lithium batteries and these e-cigarettes and other things from your carry-on bag, which is now going downstairs. And this is the reason. The FMCSA is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, they enforce the hazardous material requirements for truck drivers and the trucks. 49 CFR, this 49 CFR governs the transportation of the actual hazardous materials. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, they govern the trucks and the drivers when they transport dangerous goods or hazardous materials. And here, this rule is concerning the coercion of vehicle drivers. Coercion has to do with threats, intimidation, whistleblowers. You know, whether it's a union, whether it's a specific company, whether it's one driver against another, it's pretty much a whistleblower protection program. And that became effective in January of this year. The FAA also introduced a final rule, which became effective December 21st, 2015, but this also includes you have to have a license now. If you're going to fly a drone, you have to have a license, and there's procedures how to do it if you go to the FAA's website. But these are going to be strictly regulated as well. And what are they operated with? Lithium batteries. HM 233F became mandatory January 1st, 2016. That should have been voluntary compliance January 1st, 2000, mandatory compliance February 22nd, 2016. Special permits are special permission. If you want to do something outside the requirements of the regulations, you can petition the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration and ask them for permission to operate outside of the regulations. And they do this routinely, and they've been doing it for a long, long time. And the special permits are only good for a definite or a definitive period of time. and you would always have to reapply for the special permit. And what they're doing is they're taking special permits that have been on the books forever, and there haven't been any accidents or incidences with these special permits operating outside of the regulations, and they're incorporating them into the regulations. So they've been released in different batches at a time. And if you haven't heard of a special permit that's been incorporated into the regulations that affects your UN number, it's real easy to do. If you Google Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, special permits, and the UN numbers that you transport, you should quickly identify whether or not any of these special permits are now incorporated into the regulations. The National Highway and Traffic Safety Administration allows importers to provide information to customs in an electronic format. This is a big deal, and it's a big deal because we're also working towards the Shipper's Declaration for Dangerous Goods to be in electronic format, and pretty soon we might be completely paperless. So, and there's also some gray area when it comes to customs requirements and transportation requirements. They're two completely different entities, and I get a lot of questions concerning what are the customs requirements. You can see here from this slide that they list 19 CFR. So the customs requirements are in 19 CFR, and our transportation requirements for dangerous goods are in 49 CFR. But there is some gray area, and if you're an importer, an exporter, then you need to be familiar with both. HM251C has to do with DOT 111 tank cars. You can see there a picture of a tank car used on a train, and it's used to transport unrefined petroleum products. Unfortunately, this DOT 111 tank car has a really, really bad track record. There's been at least a half a dozen incidences or accidents with these tank cars transporting petroleum product. A lot of it has to do with the proper classification, packing groups 1, 2, or 3 when it comes to these flammable liquids. Of course, a packing group 1 would require a double wall tank car. So they came out, as a result of these accidents, they came out with plans to retrofit all of these 111 tank cars, but they're also now coming up with brand new designs in the 117, 117R tank cars, specifically to cut down on the incidents and accidents as it applies to petroleum being transported by train. The FAA, not to be outdone, they also released a final rule having to do with personal oxygen concentrators. Many of you might be familiar with the ValueJet crash. I show this routinely in my training classes. ValueJet crashed in 1996, taking off out of Miami, and it had chemical oxygen generators on board. Oxygen in a confined environment can be very, very dangerous. The reason is because it's a primary element to sustain a fire. And if you have a machine that's creating oxygen and there happens to be a fire in a confined area, that oxygen is going to sustain the fire. It's going to keep it going. So it should be strictly regulated, but here's one case where they're saying that these personal oxygen concentrators, they're talking about passengers that may need medical oxygen during the flight, they are now allowed to bring their own so long as it meets the onboard requirements. This reduces the burden on the manufacturers, the passengers, and the air carriers. The Federal Railroad Administration released several changes here. Matter of fact, this is across the board having to do with minimum and maximum civil penalties for violations of 49 CFR. This has to do, the difference between civil and criminal penalties is if you make a mistake, it's a civil penalty. But if you violate the regulations knowingly, it becomes a criminal penalty. But they continue to crack down on violations of 49 CFR. HM 218H was a miscellaneous final rule. It removes packing group 2 for certain organic peroxides and self-reactive materials and some explosives. There are requirements for damaged wet electric batteries. This may have to do with returning the damaged wet electric batteries back to the manufacturer. And there's new packaging requirements for nitric acid. They made this a final rule, and they only gave us like 30 days for public comment before they made it a final rule. And they now, with this nitric acid, they required cushioning and absorbent material for nitric acid, which was not a requirement, believe it or not. And they backed off. They allowed a transition period, but initially they only gave us like 30 days to comply. And after industry complained, they backed off and gave us a transition period. HM 253, effective March 31st of this year, they talk about reverse logistics. This had to do primarily with lithium-ion batteries. Damaged or defective lithium-ion battery, or lithium-ion or lithium metal, being returned to the manufacturer because they didn't work. And they had to really define and determine, okay, why is the battery defective? Is it defective because it simply does not hold a charge? Is it defective because there's just no juice? If that was the case and there was no reason to suspect that the battery was going to overheat or explode, they were going to allow us to return it. But if there's an issue with the battery overheating or exploding, or already overheated and exploded, then they're not going to let you send that back. There was a package supplier out of Texas that got approval from the DOT for a package to contain the damaged or defective batteries, but the manufacturer, whoever it is, if it's Sony, if it's Panasonic, whoever it might be, you need to coordinate with them directly, and they're going to have approved DOT requirements for returning defective or damaged batteries. We already talked about the enhanced 10-car standards for large quantities of flammable liquids. And HM 260, this did come out at the end of 2015. I left it in here. It still continues to be an issue. We used to have special provisions 188, 189, and 190 having to do with lithium batteries in 49 CFR. They removed those special provisions and they incorporated all of the requirements for lithium batteries in section 173.185. They actually tightened up the requirements for transporting lithium batteries, and they're pretty much parallel with the requirements for transport by ground. However, they are still different, and we need to be familiar with all of them, particularly because in the United States, by ground only, we have what's classified as medium-sized lithium batteries. The rest of the world, they only have small and large lithium batteries. But in the United States, by ground, we have small, medium, and large. So if you are transporting lithium batteries by ground, it's important that you are intimately familiar with section 173.185. And we strongly suggest that you're familiar with all requirements for transporting lithium batteries, whether it be by air, by ground, or ocean. And there's new labeling requirements this year. They have a new mark. They're changing from a lithium battery handling label to a lithium battery mark. And then they also incorporated the lithium battery handling label superimposed over a Class 9 label. And we'll talk about that when we get into IATA and ocean. We talked about the special permits already. They're being incorporated into the regulations. And here, this one, HM 233E, talking about the requirements to apply for a special permit. And the whole idea is, can you imagine the ton of paperwork that they have for hundreds and thousands of applications for special permits? So they revamped that whole process. We already talked about no e-cigarettes and checked baggage. Here are some examples, and I left it in there. You can see these two Class 9 labels. One has a horizontal line right across the middle at the top where it says old, and the one on the left does not have that thin, fine black line horizontally across the middle, and this says new. Well, that came out at the end of 2015, and that was a big brouhaha as well. And then at the bottom in the middle, this is the new Class 9 lithium battery label. So if you're shipping fully regulated Class 9 batteries, lithium batteries that are fully regulated as Class 9, this is the label that we're going to start using in 2017 for international shipments. Has not yet been incorporated into 49 CFR. This, of course, is the limited quantity mark in 49 CFR. We call it a mark, and you'll find it in section 172.300. The other regulations refer to it as a label. You can get it in the form of a label, which you apply to the box. Many manufacturers have it printed right on the box, and there's nothing wrong with that. So this one does not have a Y, a big fat capital Y right in the middle of it. That big fat capital Y on this limited quantity label would be used for transport by air. They eliminated the ORM-D for air in December 2012, but they continue to allow us to use the ORM-D marking until December 31st, 2020, at which point it's going to be replaced by this mark that you see now. So that was 49 CFR, and here is the IMDG code. You can see here on your screen, it's Amendment 38-16. It comes out every 2 years. So we just got it. We just got it at the end of 2016, which is an even year. It's an even year. So here we go into 2017, which is an odd year. And the whole idea is that during the odd years, in this case 2017, all of the changes in this book are going to be transition. They give us time to implement these new changes. And then for 2018, all of these changes are going to become mandatory. And then they'll come out again at the end of 2018 with a new book and the transition period 2019. So that's the way it works. The issue is that a lot of these steamship lines, as soon as this book comes out, it's not like they weren't published in advance. If you keep your nose to the grindstone, your ear to the ground, you're going to catch wind of the changes, the impending changes. And so when these books come out at the end of the even years, these changes have pretty much already been published. And as a result, a lot of carriers already want these impending changes, even though 2017 is a transition year, they still enforce these changes if you want them to carry your hazardous materials. There's an example of the two limited quantity marks. Of course, by air, you need the big fat Y, and by ground or ocean, the Y is not required. By ground or ocean, they will accept either one. they will accept either limited quantity mark with or without the Y. But if you're transporting by air, you better have the Y. Section 2, there's 7, this IMDG code comes in 2 volumes. Volume 1 has all of the consignment procedures. Volume 2 has the list of dangerous goods, the limited quantity section, accepted quantity section, and the special provisions. Volume 1 has all of the consignment procedures to include the packing instructions. So we'll go through these 7 sections. This is part 2, classification. I'm sure that most of you know that there's 9 different hazard classes, international standard. And what's good about this book, in section 2, if there's any changes to explosives, you'll find them in section 2.1, gases are 2.2, flammable liquids are 2.3, flammable solids 2.4, oxidizers 2.5, poisons 2.6, and so on. IATA is laid out the same way, except their classifications are in section 3. Well, this is a change here in the IMDG code section 2, and they're talking about a hazardous material that meets the definition of more than 2 different hazard classes, except the primary hazard class is clearly identified as, say, a class 3 flammable or a class 8 corrosive. But it also has a subsidiary risk with an N.O.S. entry. And this change is giving us the opportunity to call it that appropriate N.O.S. entry with the appropriate hazard class as identified through testing. Or we have to seek permission from the government to call it what the test might actually say. It's going to be very surprising if we start seeing hazardous materials with a primary hazard of 3 or 8, let's say, and then an N.O.S. subsidiary risk. That's what this is talking about. There's also a new criteria for fireworks, viscosity testing for flammable liquids. Viscosity is, how does it flow? How does the liquid flow? We can't rightly say, or possibly say, the thickness of the liquid, but there's new criteria for viscosity testing for flammable liquids. Polymerizing substances have now been classified as 4.1 flammable solids, and there are new definitions for gases, flammable liquids, poisons, and corrosives, which are prohibited for transport. This also affects the packing instructions and special provisions for these classes as well. Class 2, Class 3, Class 6, Class 8. This is a big deal. This next one, talking about proper shipping names for engines and vehicles. Up until this point, we have used UN 3166 for engines and vehicles. Well, now they have specifically reserved UN 3166 for vehicles only. And they came up with new UN numbers for UN 3528, UN 3529, and UN 3530. Depending on, is that engine flammable gas powered, like propane or natural gas? Flammable liquid powered, like gasoline or diesel fuel? And then 3530 for engines that operate on fuels that are a danger to the environment, environmentally hazardous substance. And of course, based on quantities, you may be accepted from that. But that's what they did. They separated vehicles and engines. Polyester resin kits. These are kits that have two parts. They usually had a part A and a part B, and often they were not compatible, theoretically, but they had this proper shipping name entry, polyester resin kits or resin kits. Now they separated those and came up with those that are liquid-based and or UN 3527 for those that are solid-based materials. They also talk about polymerizing substances, which are now class 4.1, and they show us the new UN numbers. Special Provision 188. For those of you that do know, and as I mentioned during the briefing for 49 CFR, all of the requirements in 49 CFR are in section 173.185. In the IMDG code, we have this special provision 188, which is the special provision for small lithium batteries. And here, special provision 188.6 specifically tells us when the lithium battery mark is required. And if it's fully regulated, then you're going to have to use that new class 9 label that shows the lithium batteries on it. There are numerous special provisions. I don't think I need to read them all. You can make notes. All of these have been added as a result of the new proper shipping names and UN numbers, new classification for the polyester resin kits, and special provision 310 talking about lithium battery prototypes and low production of lithium batteries. And also a new packing instruction 910. New packing instruction P005 for the engines, P412 polyester resin kit, and 910 for the prototype lithium cells and batteries. New packing instruction LP200. I'd like to see an aerosol that's going to go into a large package. If you were to look at 49 CFR in the hazmat table under bulk, it's prohibited. You can't have aerosols in bulk packaging. So I'd like to see this one, this container, LP200 for aerosols. This came out the end of 2015, was implemented this year, 2016. The words overpack and also the UN numbers. They have to be at least 12 millimeters high for packages that are greater than 30 liters or 30 kilos. If it's less than 30 liters or 30 kilos, it can be 6 millimeters. That's the same requirement for transport by air. Here is the new Class 9 Miscellaneous Dangerous Goods Hazard label. When transporting lithium metal or ion batteries, Special Provision 384 has been added, which refers you to Section 5.2, which refers you to the label, and it tells you, if you look in that section, each label has a model number. So model number 9 is the standard Class 9 label. Model number 9A is the Class 9 with the lithium batteries on it. This is also left over from 2016, and it was a surprise that they implemented a change in the middle of the year. As I said at the beginning, this book comes out every 2 years, and the odd years are transition periods, and the even years are enforcement periods. Well, they came out in the middle of 2016, July 1st, 2016, and it says that we have to have this container weight verification. And they give us two methods to do it. You can weigh the container empty on the back of a truck. You can load it and then weigh the truck and container again. So you're going to have an empty weight and a full weight. Or method number two is that you get the empty weight off of the data plate that's on the container, and then you weigh every package going into the container and you add them together. So when you're presenting full containers to the trucking company and or the steamship line, they're going to ask you for verification, either empty weights and full weights, or a declaration that you certify that that's a true and effective weight. Also left over from the 2015-2016 transition in the IMDG code, they updated column 16A and B, has to do with segregation and stowage codes. Ultimately, it affected section 7, which is the segregation, stowage, and loading section. For me, I find it very challenging. If you're loading different dangerous goods, different hazard classes of dangerous goods into the same container. Granted, most hazard classes are compatible with each other, and if you look at note number 2 underneath the segregation table, it tells us don't look for hazard classes 4, 6, 7, and 9 because they're not in there. They're not in the segregation table. They're compatible with everything. But when we're shipping dangerous goods, different dangerous goods loaded in the same container, we have to check column 16A and B, stowage and segregation columns, and they show us these codes in section 7, which we have to go refer to, pages, well, this year's book 440, 444. Then we also have to check the segregation table, and if that's not enough, then we have to go look in column 17 in properties and observation and make sure that these materials don't act or have an adverse reaction with the dangerous goods that we're loading in the same container. So it's quite a process to make sure that these materials are compatible with each other. There you can see the excerpts from column 16A, 16B, showing stowage codes, segregation codes, and then we have to go to section 7, and it tells us where, section 7.1, 7.3 through 7.7. And there they have tables for these stowage and segregation codes. They tell us what they mean. And lastly, we'll finish this up with the IATA Dangerous Goods Regulation, the 58th edition. It becomes effective January 1st, 2017. I think the most significant change to this book right here is an operator variation. A little background. All of these hazardous material regulations come from the United Nations. Yes, the United Nations, headquartered in New York City. There they have a committee of experts on the transport of dangerous goods. The committee of experts on the transport of dangerous goods, they publish a book called the Orange Book. And these are recommendations from the United Nations that tells all of the member countries of the United Nations how to transport dangerous goods. So all the member countries at the United Nations, they accept these recommendations and incorporate them into their own. So there is an international standard when it comes to transporting these dangerous goods. However, each of these member countries of the United Nations, they have the right and the authority to modify or adjust the recommendations from the United Nations and they make them their own. And we have our own in America, 49 CFR. I said at the beginning, I call it our American law. Well, here in this book, in the IATA regulations, they give us the opportunity to incorporate these changes in Section 2. But they don't call them changes, they call them variations. They call them operator, talking about the airline carriers, and state, talking about the different countries. State and operator variations, and we find them in Section 2.8. And I think that the most significant change of the changes, I think the most significant ones are the operator variations from FedEx and UPS in Section 2 that says that they will no longer accept lithium batteries, UN 3480 and UN 3090, prepared in accordance with Section 2 of the applicable packing instructions. They want lithium batteries by themselves prepared as fully regulated. UN spec box, class 9 lithium battery handling label. Miscellaneous handling label. Excuse me. So here we go. This book has 10 sections, and we'll go through here. Section 10 having to do with radioactive material, and then they get into all the appendices. Also, so you know, when I was a kid, you used to go to the airport and they had a ticket window, and right next to the check-in window, and you would buy a ticket, and then you'd get in the check-in line and get on the airplane. When you did that, they used to have signs at check-in that said, "Be advised that you may be carrying dangerous goods." And what they're getting into now is that the whole process is evolving to paperless. It's going electronic. It's going social media. And they're advising that the airlines still have a responsibility to notify their passengers that they may be carrying dangerous goods. So now you buy a ticket online, and before you can pay for the ticket, the window pops up and says, you have to check this. I acknowledge that I may be carrying dangerous goods, and you have to make sure that you click that box before you can buy your ticket. In Section 2.2, there's a couple, 3 pages there. They talk about hidden dangerous goods, most automobile parts, camping equipment, home medical devices, and stuff like that, where hidden dangerous goods may be. But they now add a note, because if you haven't heard of GHS, GHS stands for Global Harmonization System. And it too, it's a UN baby. It came from the United Nations. They advertised it, I think, back in 2013. They started implementing it last year in 2015. People have been very slow to get on board. But there's now a lot of confusion because we're seeing these pictograms. That's what the GHS calls them. Pictograms. What do they look like? They look very similar to our hazard warning labels for transportation. And they're telling us here that some packages may have these pictograms on there, but they're not regulated in transportation. They are regulated in the workplace. And they're regulated in the workplace because exposure to them could cause personal injury. And the standards for dangerous goods in the workplace are different from dangerous goods in transportation. And when we get to Section 8, the documentation section, they're also recommending that we put a note on the airway bill that says, hey, I get it, these are regulated in the workplace, but they're not regulated in transportation. I wrote an article or a blog about these differences, and you can find it at dgitraining.com/blog. There's several articles there about topics that cause a lot of questions. And one of them is these GHS requirements, GHS versus transportation. What is also new in section 1.6.2 in the IATA regulations is that they actually give a definition for adequate instruction. As I said earlier, when we were talking about lithium batteries and 49 CFR, only in the United States by ground do we have small, medium, and large lithium batteries. The rest of the world, talking about IATA now, they only have small and large. Well, if you have a small lithium battery and you go to the appropriate packing instruction, and small lithium batteries are discussed in section 2 of the appropriate packing instruction, it says that you are accepted from all other requirements of the regulations except for training, and that you have to have adequate training to ship these small lithium batteries. Well, everybody said, well, what's adequate training? So they give us the definition for adequate training. We have to know the understanding. We have to have an understanding of the classification. We have to know the difference between a small battery and a large battery. Lithium-ion batteries are regulated by their watts-hour. Watt-hour. How much electricity do they produce? And 100 watt-hours, generally, is the cutoff for a battery. 100 watt-hours is the cutoff for a lithium-ion rechargeable battery. If your lithium-ion rechargeable battery is less than 100 watt-hours, it's considered a small lithium battery. If your lithium-ion rechargeable battery is 100 watt-hours or more, it would be considered a large battery. And a large lithium battery is fully regulated. For a lithium metal battery, these are the small, round, button cell type generally, but they're now coming in all shapes and sizes. Lithium metal batteries are non-rechargeable. We generally find them in clocks and calculators, cameras, some medical devices. They're non-rechargeable. These are regulated by the quantity of lithium contained in them. And again, generally, if your battery, lithium metal, primary non-rechargeable battery, contains 2 grams of lithium or less, it's considered a small battery. If your lithium metal, primary, non-rechargeable, contains more than 2 grams of lithium, then it's considered a large battery. Both lithium-ion and lithium metal batteries, by themselves, are prohibited for transport as cargo on passenger airplanes. So you need to be familiar, and your training should include all of these things. That last line there is reverse logistics. I touched on that briefly with 49 CFR. You still have to be trained, and your customers have to be educated to a point where they know that they are shipping damaged or defective lithium batteries back to the manufacturer. They have to be aware of the prohibitions, and it's up to the manufacturer to make their customer aware of what these prohibitions may be. In section 2.6, they talk about accepted quantities. There's the label for accepted quantities. They're now giving us the opportunity to provide absorbent material in the intermediate packaging or in the outer packaging for liquid dangerous goods. I told you right off the bat, when introducing the changes for IATA, I believe that the most significant changes here on this slide operator variations, FedEx and UPS will no longer accept lithium ion or lithium metal batteries by themselves prepared in accordance with Section 2 of the packing instructions. They want these batteries by themselves prepared as fully regulated. So the state and operator variations are in Section 2.8 of the IATA regulations. Go there, look at the variations that apply to the countries that you ship to. Look at the variations that your airline has shown and or listed in Section 2.8. Here's that same requirement talking about dangerous goods that meet the definition of more than one hazard class, and the subsidiary or secondary risk happens to be an N.O.S. entry. They give us the opportunity. You can get approval from the government to use a specific subsidiary or secondary risk, or after testing, it's clear and cut that that N.O.S. entry is either a Class 8 or a Class 3. It's very clear, and you may use that as a secondary or subsidiary classification based on the testing results. When you are getting approval from our government, and those of you in the explosives industry, you know very well that our government does run a tight ship, and they're now saying that you must have or provide in writing the exact classification process that you went through in order to classify your explosives. Provisions have been added for Class 2 gases, Class 3 flammable liquids, Class 6 poisons, Class 8 corrosives, respectively, that may polymerize during normal conditions to transport. In Section 3.6 has to do with the classification requirements for infectious substances in live animals. This has been revised. There have been revisions to a number of different entries for aerosols, which affect the packing instructions 203 and Y203. Also, special provision A209 has been added for entries with stabilized in the proper shipping name. We've discussed already that the entries for engines have been deleted from 3166. UN 3166 is now solely applies to the proper shipping name vehicles. And they've added 3 new UN numbers for engines: 3528, 3529, and 3530. And we're going to classify them as a flammable gas, a flammable liquid, or a Class 9 based on the fuel that they use. We can also use those same UN numbers for proper shipping names that use the word machines. I kept this from last year. Lithium batteries, UN 3090, lithium metal batteries across the board to show forbidden as cargo on passenger airplanes. I left it there because now they have the same entry for lithium ion batteries as cargo on passenger airplanes. This is not reflected in 49 CFR section 173.185. I strongly suspect that we're going to have a final rule that's going to come out this year that will parallel or harmonize, as they say, with this international requirement. I've also mentioned several times the new Class 9 miscellaneous label that includes the lithium batteries. If you're shipping fully regulated lithium batteries, then you're going to get that Class 9 miscellaneous hazard label with the lithium battery superimposed on top of it. Again, they're allowing a 2-year transition period. We can start using it this year, 2017. But by the end of 2018, it's going to be mandatory. Just like ocean polyester resin kits, they've been divided into solid-based material and liquid-based material. And as a result, they've added these new UN numbers and the special provision. There's new entries for radioactive material, 2977, UN 3507. Section 4.4, there have been a number of special provisions that have been added. I don't think I need to go through each one. You, however, should review all of them and make sure that they do not apply to your particular product or materials that you routinely handle. If you do, then you need to implement these changes, and you should train yourself and your employees on these changes. Until the next time that you attend recurrent training. A104, methanol, UN 1230. The international standard was that this methanol had to carry the subsidiary 6.1 poison label in addition to the class 3 label. If you look at 49 CFR, it shows it both times. It shows methanol listed twice, one for international transport and one for domestic transport. Domestically, we don't have to put that poison label on there. But what they've determined is that although methanol, through testing, does not meet the definition of a poison, they use laboratory rats to test a material to see if it meets the definition of a poison. Some of you may be familiar with it. LD50 stands for lethal dose, or LC50, lethal concentration. And when 50% of the rats die, it meets the definition of a poison. Well, methanol doesn't kill the rats, so it doesn't meet a definition of the poison. But it makes us, human beings, it makes us sick. So the international standard was we had to put the 6.1 sub-risk label on there. Now they're telling us it's mandatory and we have to have it on there. A1112 was a special provision that tells us which materials may be shipped as a consumer commodity. They've added aviation regulated substances, liquids, and solids. 3334, 3335. Special provision A181 has to do if you put lithium batteries contained in equipment and lithium batteries packed in equipment in the same box. You can do this, but again, for those of you that don't know, there's 3 different risk categories with lithium batteries. The most dangerous, or the one that poses the highest degree of risk, are lithium batteries shipped by themselves. Lithium batteries packed with equipment represents a medium risk, and lithium batteries contained in equipment represent the smallest risk when it comes to lithium batteries. So if we have lithium batteries contained in equipment like a laptop or a cell phone, it represents a smaller risk. But then we throw in spare batteries. Well, the risk goes up. And when we mix lithium batteries packed with equipment and lithium batteries contained in equipment, that shipment has to be prepared in accordance with lithium batteries packed with equipment. (202) for gases, 202 for polymeric beads. Polymeric beads, this is like expandable foam stuff, and if it gets heated, it releases hydrocarbons called pentane. It can be very dangerous. So there's a new special provision discussing these polymeric beads. (211) has to do with UN 1067 and nitrogen dioxide, nitric oxide, UN 1660. They may, if they are used in sterilization processes or sterilization devices, they may be shipped on passenger and cargo aircraft. 212 has to do with nitric acid. Again, if it affects you, you need to look at it. 302 and 324, they remove the requirement from the appropriate government of the state of destination. Usually requires the state of origin, has to approve certain requirements. Another big deal, this actually came out in 2016, it's being enforced 2017. It applies to lithium-ion batteries, lithium-ion rechargeable batteries being shipped by themselves. They cannot be in a state of charge of more than 30%. Although they cannot duplicate in the laboratory why these lithium batteries explode, they have determined this inherent characteristic called thermal runaway, and they have found out that these batteries display or exhibit this thermal runaway the higher percent of charge they have. So if they're kept at 30% or less, the percentage of thermal runaway goes down. So if you're shipping UN 3480 lithium batteries by themselves, they cannot be at more than 30% state of charge. There's numerous packing instructions that have been updated and or changed. Packing instructions 965 through 970 have to do with lithium batteries. Again, if you ship lithium batteries by themselves, packed with equipment, or contained in the equipment, you need to review all of the changes. And if you're using FedEx or UPS, you need to review their requirements for transporting lithium batteries on their airplanes. This year, there was a requirement to have another document that described all of the danger characteristics about the lithium batteries, and you had to have a phone number, and they referred to it as a battery information sheet. This battery information sheet is no longer required. What they found out is that the information was being duplicated. It's not necessary. Now this is in contrast to the FedEx and UPS variations. If you look at these packing instructions, section 2, it says that the exception from the application of the lithium battery handling label, meaning you don't have to do it, if there are no more than 2 such packages in the consignment, and you can have, say, 2 laptops or 2 cell phones in a box, and you don't have to put the label. And what FedEx and UPS are saying, we don't care. They're not going to accept those lithium batteries by themselves prepared in accordance with Section 2. I need to define here. The FedEx and UPS requirements only applies to batteries by themselves. It does not apply to laptops or cell phones where the lithium batteries are contained in the equipment. Here is the new lithium battery mark. It's no longer a label, they call it a mark, and the new Class 9 miscellaneous lithium battery label. And here they tell us there's a 2-year transition period. We can use the old ones until December 31st, 2018. 2019 going to be mandatory. Hard to believe they came up with the UN number for engines that may be using fuel classified as environmentally hazardous. Packing Instruction 972. I left this up from the previous year. There were severe limitations on overpacks and the cargo aircraft only label. They have been removed. And you know that the overpack marking must be at least 12 millimeters high, and that we can mix non-dangerous goods and dangerous goods in the same overpack as long as they do not react dangerously with each other. Section 6 is all about UN spec packaging, and here they refer to when and where the ISO standards can be applied for the manufacturer. We've already talked about the new lithium battery marks and labels. Label Master's already selling them. Here's Section 8 for documentation. They've added a note to identify that notwithstanding the change to the UN numbers and classes for engines, the shippers may still consign engines as 3166 as a Class 9 until March 2017. So they're giving us a 3-month transition period here as well. Talking about clarification for multiple overpacks. If you look in the back of Section 8 and they give examples, they talk about multiple overpacks and multiple identical overpacks. And they tell us that we're supposed to have alphanumeric codes like A1, A2, Bravo 1, Bravo 2. So you have multiple overpacks. Look in the back of Section 9 where they give clear examples on how that documentation, in the back of Section 8, right before Section 9, where they give clear examples of how the documentation is supposed to be filled out. Also, Step 9, the authorization column on the shipper's declaration, they've added some special provisions there. Here they're saying in Section 8.1.6, the paragraph identifying for shipments of lithium batteries prepared under Section 1B, 965, and 968, that the information required on additional document is no longer required. That's what I said a moment ago, that's additional document or battery information sheet is no longer required. And you no longer have to put your job title in the signature block on the shipper's declaration. For those of you, and I would imagine almost all of you, are using software to produce your shipper's declarations. And a lot of these software programs do not include the annual updates. So if you've been using the same software program for your shipper's declaration for a few years now, it might be a good idea to invest and get an updated software program for your shipper's declaration. And here they're talking about, I told you, I mentioned this, these GHS pictograms. They're saying it might be a good idea to put on the airway bill, not restricted, if your packages contain the diamond-shaped pictograms required by GHS. Here in section 9, they apply to the operator, talking about acceptance checklist, as well as acceptance of a shipper loaded unit device, or ULD. This is a picture of an LD3 container, and generally hazardous materials are prohibited from being loaded in cargo containers, with the exception here. They're going now to allow 3373 and ID 8000 to be in the ULD with dry ice. The NOTOC is an acronym for Notice to Commander, or Notice to the Captain of the airplane. And anytime dangerous goods are loaded on an airplane, the person that's responsible for the loading, they go up into the cockpit, and or when the captain gets a briefing at dispatch, they're given a copy of the NOTOC, and it tells them exactly what dangerous goods are loaded on the airplane, how much are loaded on the airplane, and where they are loaded on the airplane. Here in this case, they're giving the opportunity that if they load ID 8000 consumer commodities, that they can use the average gross weight when they put it on the shipper's declaration. Section 9.8.2, they're now going to require the name of the person that used the checklist to accept the dangerous goods. This is a holdover from the year before. If you're using that cargo aircraft only label on the left side, get rid of them, throw them away. We're using now the one that says cargo aircraft only. And there have been changes to all of these appendices in the back of the book. Appendix H has to do with the changes that are coming down the next year. So if you want to see what they're thinking about for 2018, go look at Appendix H. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate it very much. My name and telephone number you can find at dgitraining.com. You can also find inside the front cover of every single DGI workbook. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for attending. Look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you. Bye-bye.